At this point, let's talk just for a moment about the selections that we are reading for this particular course. It's a pretty broad range. It's not a lot of reading, but it covers a lot of ground. So on the one hand, we have a Latin American novel that falls into, as we've already mentioned, into the genre of dictator novels. And that is La Fiesta del Chivo by Mario Vargas Llosa. And this is a very interesting novel. It's intriguing, at times very disturbing, uses some very interesting techniques, and we'll be exploring that more, and especially my colleague, Eduardo Fernández, will be talking more about that. On the other end of the spectrum, we're looking at two short stories, and these short stories are by the American Southern writer Flannery O'Connor. And the stories are entitled, the first one is A Good Man is Hard to Find, the second one is Good Country People. So it's an interesting assortment, but we've deliberately put these together once again to give an appreciation for the range and for the possibilities that could go into a study like this. The possibilities are endless. There's an infinite number of works that we could be looking at, and so this is the selection for our purposes. But asking again the question, what's the point? I mean, why combine politics and literature? Why engage in this kind of study? I mean, why not keep them separate? Why not talk about politics and why not talk about literature? What's the advantage of putting these together? And as a way of trying to get at that question, let me read a quote by Flannery O'Connor herself from her collection of essays called Mystery and Manners. And she said that a story is a way to say something that can't be said any other way. And it takes every word in the story to say what the meaning is. You tell a story because a statement would be inadequate. In other words, there are some ideas, there are some principles that can best be conveyed through literature. And when we're talking about literature here, for the most part, we are talking about fiction. We might make allowances for a little bit of variation in that genre, but for the most part, we're talking about fiction. So what is it about this combination that can help us to understand the things that we're trying to get at? Well, picking up on O'Connor's observation, we might note that there's something about literature that invokes the imagination. It also invokes the emotions. And at the same time, it engages the intellect. Whereas if we were just looking at prose, if we're just looking at nonfiction, then certainly we're engaging the intellect, but we may not be invoking the imagination or even the passions in the same way that we can if we make a combination of these things. And Aristotle's very famous study of drama, the poetics, he explains to us that there's something about a dramatic presentation, and we can apply the same idea to literature. There's something about a dramatic presentation in a fictional form that can engage the listener in a way that the listener may not be able to partake of that kind of discussion otherwise. So there are advantages to this kind of study then, because it involves more of the person, more of the human person. And by so doing, we are hoping, and I think that experience proves it correct, that we will understand, we will appreciate what we're reading, what we're talking about, and it may change us, and it may in some ways inspire us to engage in the political life in a way that we might not be able to do so, or might not be inspired to do that. So let's divide up politics and literature into two categories for our purposes right now. The first category would be the most obvious, and that category is what we might call the political novel. And so one of our selections then is the dictator novel, La Fiesta del Chivo, and this is explicitly political. And it's, again, it's part of a larger genre of literature, and I don't think it takes a great deal of explanation to see the connection between the historical fiction, and the purpose of the literature, and combining these two. Now, another example of this category of politics and literature would be something that's very well known, and that would be what we call the dystopian novel. The dystopian novel goes way back, depends on what you define as a dystopian novel, but there are all kind of examples that we could use. Now, some people divide a dystopian and a utopian novel up into two different categories, but we really, I think the most intelligent way to go about this is to take our cue from Sir Thomas More, who was the Chancellor for Henry VIII, also a literary genius, and his book Utopia tells us in a tongue-in-cheek way that a utopia is going to turn into a dystopia. And so even the title of his novel, Utopia, means literally in Greek, no place. Now, there are a few novels, and we'll mention a couple in a moment, that hold to the idea that we can create a kind of a utopia, but for the most part, we are combining these two ideas. That is, a utopian novel is also a dystopian novel. And by dystopian, we mean it describes a place where none of us would want to live. So just to give a few examples of that. In 1915, Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote a novel called Herland, and it talks about a world in which no men are present. Women run things. Women have learned how to procreate without the assistance of men. And so this is a world that is run by women. Now, this would tend to be more of a utopian novel, and there's some very interesting lessons that we could draw from this. However, things get dark pretty quickly when we look at one of the most famous dystopian novels, and that is 1984 by George Orwell, that was written in 1949. It's been put into in the form of a very good movie as well. 1984 is definitely a dystopian place, and so much of our discourse in politics today, especially when we're talking about totalitarian regimes, when we're talking about tyrants, when we're talking about the dictator, we often borrow from the language of 1984 to help us understand what the authoritarian regime does to language, what it does to the people who live under that regime, and what it does to the society that's controlled. It's truly a depressing tale. Now, a novel that 1984 is often compared with is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, written in 1932. And this, in some ways, appears to be a kind of a utopian novel, yet and some people would say that Brave New World is a better description of the modern age than even 1984. Brave New World is a world in which people are not so much controlled by the government or by dictators as they are controlled by their own basest passions, as they are controlled by their unquenchable, irresistible pursuit of pleasure. And so there's so many principles that could be drawn out of Brave New World, but it again falls into this dystopian genre, and it also is an example of books that are explicitly political. More quickly, there are several other novels that we might mention. One would be Men Like Gods, written by H.G. Wells in 1923, and it describes an anarchic society, a society with no government. It pretends also to be a kind of utopia. I think the reader has to decide if the case for a utopia is made in this particular novel. More recently, a product of the 1960s and especially environmental movements in the 1970s is a novel entitled Ectopia by Ernest Kallenbach in 1975. Recently, a TV series has been produced to great success on Margaret Atwood's tale, A Handmaid's Tale, which talks about a future dystopian society in which women have been relegated to a place in which their only role is to procreate because of a scourge of sterility in society. Now, There is a emerging body of dystopian literature in the Middle East, and one novel is by Basma Abdel Aris and called The Q. She is in Cairo, Egypt. Her day job, is to counsel victims of torture, and one day, as a way of trying to relieve that kind of stress and make some sense of the madness, she decided to write a novel, a dystopian novel, as a way of capturing the kind of distress, the kind of agony, the kind of madness that people were experiencing. And then finally, we might say that there's a sort of a new age of dystopian literature that is beginning to emerge. And it's interesting because we're finding that what makes the calamities, what makes the catastrophes in this literature is often has to do with environmental catastrophes, climate warming, global warming, if you would, and those sorts of environmental forces, or some sort of economic apocalypse. So there's a way in which dystopian literature can reflect the politics of the time, as well as informing us about politics at the same time.